Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to a co-production between the Mormon Sex Info and Mormon Mental Health podcasts. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker. Super excited to be back. I know that I've missed a week or two here, and I just want to apologize to everybody, but there's only so much you can do sometimes. And when you get deathly ill for 10 flipping days,
I'm sorry.
It kind of puts a little bit of an issue in your plans.
Wow.
So that's been happening. But a few thoughts really quickly before we get too far ahead. I wanted to just point out that I will be in Houston the weekend of July 13th through 15th for a Mormon Stories retreat. So there's still, I believe, a little bit of room in that retreat for anybody who still wants to sign up. These are really good for people who are going through faith transitions, people in mixed faith marriages or mixed faith relationships with family members that you love or care about. We focus on kind of healthy relationships, healthy sexuality, healthy parenting, healthy marriages. It's really useful stuff. So if anybody's in the Houston area, we'd love to have you there. And you can go to mormonstories.org to figure out more information on that. You can also visit natashaparker.org, and I usually have all the information on there as well. Also, Sunstone is coming up end of July. So that will start, I believe, July 26th, 27th, 28th. And we've been offered by Sunstone, our podcasts have been offered like 2 free tickets. So I'll be picking subscribers from both of my podcasts so that you can get some Sunstone tickets out of that. So keep your eye out to see if you are a subscriber or you're a donor, and you might win some tickets if you're interested in going to that event, which is also fabulous. All right, I think that's all the announcements I have. Tonight, I am so pleased to have Shannon Hickman with me for our book club / sex talk / whatever it is that we call
everything, anything goes.
Anything sex and Mormon. We try to have once a month because there's always interesting articles that either come up in Mormon world or in the research world, or there's just all kinds of information out there that I think is applicable to our audiences. And so we want to make sure we take some time to cover those topics, and we make sure that everybody who's on this show is a certified sex therapist through the Association of ASECT, which is the American Association for, sex counselors, therapists, and educators, something around that line, but I'm sure I didn't say that right. Okay, Shannon, can you give us a quick introduction? You've been on the show before, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So like Natasha said, my name's Shannon Hickman, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm also a certified sex therapist through ASECT. And my practice is called Core Healing Counseling, and it's in Murray. And I work with a lot of couples, a lot of Mormon couples, and also a lot of individuals around marriage therapy and also sex therapy.
Awesome. And she does great work, and I will definitely link to all of your stuff so that if you're needing any help professionally, she's a great resource in the northern Salt Lake City area, if I'm saying that correctly, correct?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, great. All right, well, let's get started. We have a few articles that we want to touch on tonight. I was told about this research article that actually was published at the end of April of this year, and it was published in the Journal of Sex Research. We will link to this. And it's called God, I Can't Stop Thinking About Sex, the Rebound Effect and Unsuccessful Suppression of Sexual Thoughts Among Religious Adolescents. So this is an interesting study done actually in Israel with Orthodox Jewish adolescents, comparing them to more secular adolescents and figuring out what is going on. So this actually correlates nicely with a lot of the work that we've talked about and a lot of our concerns with Mormon adolescents, and sometimes the rebound effect, the unintentional effect sometimes when we focus so much on pornography or sexual behaviors or premarital sex and keeping people chaste and pure. And when we have so much of a focus on that, sometimes it can result in the opposite of what we want, which is an increase of those behaviors or thoughts. And the article is, or the research is talked about in a nice article called Attempts to Suppress Sexual Thoughts Could Result in an Increase of Those Thoughts on SciPost, and we'll also link to that. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this, and then Shannon, if you want to give me your thoughts. I don't think we'll spend a lot of time on this because to me this is kind of like a, well, duh, but
you touched on it a lot. Yeah.
So it's good to have research support the oh does moments in life.
A good reminder.
Yeah, a good reminder. So the study author, which I'm sure I'm going to say the name incorrectly, but it's Yaniv Efrati. He says, I grew up in a religious community and today I define myself as religious. I have noticed over the years that the subject of sexuality in the religious public is more complex than the secular public. I also notice that many religious people are busy with the question of whether their sexual behavior is normal or not. So I think that's something that we could probably relate to. And so he studied teens who called themselves observant Jewish teens and also secular teens. And the religious adolescents tended to report lower well-being, which was linked to their preoccupation with unwanted sexual thoughts. So the lower well-being was actually that they're worried about whether or not they're quote unquote righteous, and that they had more preoccupation of unwanted sexual thoughts and fantasies than secular adolescents. So anything you want to say about that?
Well, oh my gosh, so many things are coming up. So it sort of reminds me of like OCD a little bit, which what we know about OCD is it's really just a way of managing anxiety. So they're probably having a lot of anxiety when they have these sexual thoughts, and then it becomes obsessive because they're even more worried about it and how are we going to control it. So that's coming up for me. And also I'm just thinking, like, this is where a lot of times with my clients, I'll talk about just in Europe, the difference in how we treat sex and bodies versus how we treat it here in the United States. With in Europe, a soap commercial could be a nude woman. It's just a soap commercial and it's just a body. But here we put so much emphasis and focus on, being pure and that it's not okay and it's bad, that it becomes such a sexualized, hyped up thing rather than just looking at it as this is a normal part of development. This is a normal part of who we are.
Yeah, and he actually speaks here to the parents in particular. He says, in my studies and work with sexual compulsive behavior in adults, I find that parental responses to child sexual behavior, and he specifically calls out masturbation and pornography viewing, are very significant in compulsive sexual development. Comments regarding sexuality as being a dirty thing or forbidden only cause the development of compulsive sexual behavior.
Exactly.
That's pretty pretty upfront. And I would just say that this matches my clinical experience. I mean, I wrote my now probably a little bit infamous masturbation blog in regards to this concern because I felt like when we make sin something that's fairly normal in the developmental stages of adolescence, you're kind of setting up everybody for failure. And kids who really care, this is kind of what's most tragic, the kids who really care, the kids who are really wanting to be righteous, right? The kids who are really worried about being worthy and perfect and wanting to be like unto God, these are the language that they use, tend to be the kids that end up suffering the most from this, because the kids who are not as harmed are the kids who know how to roll their eyes at us, right? Or just kind of say whatever, or they don't feel like it's important to confess about certain things, or they have different boundaries. It's the kids who really want to do it all correctly that end up, I think, really struggling to the point of suicidal thoughts, of self-abuse behavior in my office that they've told me about. I mean, just really, really unfortunate when you think these kids, I mean, they're fairly wholesome, nice, young kids with not a lot of sexual experience for the most part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you have a lot more experience seeing teens and working with kids, but I see the aftermath of what happens when they're young adults, and in relationships and still struggling with it.
Do you want to speak a little bit more about that in the sense of how does that show up later in life?
Yeah, sure. So, a couple of ways. One, a lot of times people have a really difficult time when they get married, and we've talked about this lots before on your show. But flipping that switch, they can't flip the switch to all of a sudden, oh, sex is good, it's healthy, it's okay. All of this exploring my partner's body and what feels good and letting them explore my body, and they just can't flip the switch. And so sex is surrounded by worries, anxiety, fears, and pleasure is nowhere to be found in there.
Yeah.
I also see it come up a lot with people who are exactly kind of the personality type you're talking about. And then they start to have a lot more difficulty with intrusive thoughts and obsessive compulsive issues and disorder. So that's how I've seen it kind of come up.
Right. Anytime that you think, tell yourself not to think about something, it's harder. I mean, it's true for so many human behaviors, it's why dieting is hard and anything that you're trying to change, because you're putting a lot of focus and energy on it. So it's almost like what you resist persists, right? That's the famous kind of little quote. And so, yeah, it's really unfortunate. And then he goes on to kind of talk a little bit more about some of the research that's come out of, oh gosh, I want to say Montana. Joshua Grubbs is the name of the researcher, and I think he's in Montana, but I can't totally remember now. But this researcher says it would not be prudent to say that religious people have a higher compulsive sexual behavior than secular people. It's that I see that religious people in self-reporting will indeed report that they have a compulsive sexual behavior when in practice they do not have a compulsive sexual behavior. They define themselves as such because of the negative feelings, shame, and guilt of the conflict in which they live, sexuality versus religion. So this is kind of copying Joshua Grubbs' work, which is that people who tend to come from religious backgrounds will say, I'm a sex addict or I'm sexually compulsive. But when you really start asking very detailed questions about the frequency and what they're doing, it's not any more so necessarily than the general public. But because we have zero tolerance of any behavior, being inappropriate, like it's not common to find active believing Mormons saying, well, you decreased your pornography viewing by 60%. So hooray for you. It's no, are you at 0% compliance? And if not, then there's a problem. And so anytime you have that type of rigidity with any type of human behavior, you're going to have a lot of people really struggling as far as how they self-identify and what they call these behaviors, which the rest of the world's just kind of like, so what? It's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
Or they just have different value systems around it, or they have different contracting in their relationships because they don't have the same guilt and shame associated with those behaviors.
Yeah, I use that all the time with clients. I mean, if you have one person over here that looks at porn, once a day or once every other day or a couple times a week, and they're okay with it, they're not having a conflict, right? They're okay with it. But if you have somebody else they're looking at it maybe once a week and it goes against all of their core values and belief system, now we've got a concern. We've got an issue.
Right.
And that's where, and I think are you thinking of the person that did, because somebody else did a study, right, out of BYU to do.
Oh yeah, there was a BYU study as well. Yes. Which again corroborates
that's not who you're
Joshua
talking
Grubbs'
about.
work. No, Joshua Grubbs was the first research I saw on this. And he has several research studies that have been published around this kind of theme.
Yeah.
And then, yes, I did an interview with the BYU professor. I'll link to that as well, that kind of corroborated that research.
Mm-hmm.
And then now this is another one. So,
yeah. And
which is what we want to see. We want to see
Yeah.
research duplicated. We want to see if we're getting the same results across even different religious denominations.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like for a lot of these people too, it is what you were saying, that perfectionism. It's not just the area of sex. It's I'm trying to excel and be perfect in all areas, right? And especially pertaining to the religion. But that's been the people that I've seen most affected by it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I would agree.
You see that with kids too.
No, and that's what would have made me so sad about the adolescents I would see. I mean, they were just these sweet, innocent, lovely kids, that just were so hard on themselves. And just the best of our people, in this developmental stage. Versus I've seen some of the other adolescents, which I think they're great too.
Right. There's nothing wrong with
the less innocent ones, right? The ones that are like, oh yeah, I'm a virgin, even though I'm having anal sex, ha, ha, ha.
But they're not having the anxiety and obsessive.
Right. So we have those teens too, and I love them just as much. I think they're just as great.
Yeah.
But they're going at it from a very different perspective.
Yes.
They're finding the loopholes and they're kind of, trying to make sense. And not that those kids don't have sexual shame issues as well often, but sometimes it presents in different ways or it doesn't impact them at the same level as some of these other kids who are just the real kind of go-getters as far as the wanting to do everything right and feeling so guilty. But to the point of anytime anything is kind of getting to the point of self-abuse. I've had several return missionaries, for example, that are in my office and maybe were sent home for anxiety disorders. But really when it comes down to it, nobody's really asking them about their sexuality. And sometimes that anxiety has to do with the fact that they masturbated once on their mission, right? Or the fact that they felt like they had improper thoughts. I mean, we're not even talking about, people who are necessarily crossing any lines behaviorally, but that just really beat themselves up in their own mind about anything that would be seen as impure or unworthy. I mean, these are heavy laden words, right? These are words with a lot of meaning.
Right, which I think is why we always, you and I and Kristen always go back to how much we need sex education at early ages and lots of conversations around it, because so much of this is part of just normal, healthy sexual development, just human behavior.
That's right.
And but they don't know that because they're not having discussions about it.
Right. So they think they're weird.
How bad and wrong, and they think everyone else isn't having these thoughts, and they must be really awful.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Sex ed.
Yes, comprehensive sex ed. Woo, woo. All right, so moving on from that, because that just is great research that supports things we've been talking about for years, so we're always happy when that happens. We are going to spend some time talking about the articles that were shared on the blog from Josh and Lolly Weed. And I spent probably about 5 minutes or 10 minutes talking about this, maybe in one podcast, but I don't feel like we did it a lot of service. So I wanted to do a little deeper dive in this, just to give some history. So Josh Weed is a fairly popular kind of blogger within the Mormon circles. He is a therapist himself, and he wrote a blog back in 2012 called Club Unicorn, in which I come out of the closet on our 10-year anniversary. So he and his wife Lolly decided together to come out as a mixed orientation couple. So he's a gay man married to a heterosexual woman. And they did a really good job, I think, of talking about kind of their perspective, of course, from a Mormon construct, why this at the time really felt right to them and worked for them, and kind of gave their love story, their history together, and, talking about having their children. So all in the construct, of course, of this Mormon background. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the results that came from that. And then just recently in January of this year, they wrote another, so this is 5 years later, basically, another blog saying, "Turning a unicorn into a bat, the post in which we announce the end of our marriage." And they get very real throughout this blog post. So I think both blog posts were very real. They were very much where they were at the time. And so we're going to do a little deeper dive into this. Neither one of us are homosexual. And so we're just really coming at this from the sex therapist perspective and what we've seen with populations within Mormonism and some of the themes that run in these kinds of issues. So why don't we start off a little bit, Shannon, by talking as far as what do you think the impact was in regards to that first article within the LGBT community, especially within Mormonism?
Well, I think they were really trying to shed light on a very difficult topic and to probably provide some hope and, really just hope for couples that were, or individuals that were going through this, right? That they could have a good life, that they could be married, that they could have kids, that there was a future, right, in this for them. Right. Because I think they talked, right, from what I gather, I think they talked a lot about how they were really connecting, how they'd figured out, did they talk about how they figured out sex, that all of this was happening in their relationship, and what a positive, amazing marriage that they had. So
yeah, and I think
felt really hopeful to a lot of people.
And with the backdrop
being the Mormon community.
Right. With the backdrop being our construct as a Mormon people, where really a homosexual person does not have a way to remain quote unquote worthy within their orientation. Right. And so gay people in our church are really either expected to, one, stay celibate. And that's not just sexually celibate, that's kind of like romantically celibate, which I think a lot of people don't always think about the implications of that. I mean, think about every time you've had a crush, think about every time you've had a feeling, think about any time you've had a desire to ask somebody on a date. I mean, a lot of times we get caught up in the sex parts, right? But this is celibacy is much, 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 much bigger than sex, right? So it's really relational celibacy.
Well, and even when I'm sure you do this too, I do a really in-depth sexual history at times, depending on concerns. And we go way, 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 way back.
Yeah.
Like earliest memories. And this is, tell me about crushes, right? That's like, we're young.
Yeah.
A lot of times elementary school, junior highs are first crushes.
Oh, I was having like sexual fantasies about Cinderella's husband. I think at about 4.5.
Right. I asked. When do you remember first knowing you had a gender?
Yep.
Yeah, way back. That's like 3, 4.
Yep.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. So, or the other option, of course, is to get married in a heterosexual marriage.
Or not act on the same sex attraction. Exactly. Those
right.
Are the 2 options, right?
Yeah, which really pretty much puts people in an impossible kind of catch-22. Not to mention that, not that long ago, the options really included, much more so the recommendations to go through reparative therapies, to really try to change your orientation. And people have done some fairly horrific things to themselves. Well, I should restate that. The mental health profession has done some fairly horrific things to people who have put their trust or hope, in some of those ideologies or theories that, started back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, all the way from electroshock therapies to, and they still happen today, unfortunately, although there's a big move for making these types of therapies which have zero evidence and of working or of, and in fact, actually causing quite a bit of damage, psychological damage to people. There's a big move in making these therapies illegal, at least for minors. not necessarily in general, but at least for minors, we've had some luck in some states here in the United States. But anyway, I regress. So when this initial blog came out, I had a lot of mixed feelings. On the one hand, I really wanted to honor their story. You know, they were really honest about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they were very, very vulnerable and shared something that a lot of people find themselves in that situation and are needing that kind of support or help, or like, oh, we're not the only ones trying to do this.
Mm-hmm.
They were a little bit, I would say, they didn't follow kind of the formula that I usually saw at that time clinically. Usually in my practice at that time, you know, I'm talking about like 10 years ago, the classic presentation was that the spouse, the heterosexual spouse, did not know going into the marriage that their spouse had any type of same-sex attraction or had any orientation concerns. And in fact, that was the actual advice that most ecclesiastical leaders would give, you know, 20, 30, 50 years ago. Yeah, it's like, there's no need to let them know. Just get married. You'll be fine. Start having sex. You know, you'll be fine. Again, very sex-oriented, not really understanding anything about orientation, sexual orientation.
Do you think this letter changed that? Or do you feel like that was even happening before Josh wrote this? Like people were actually coming out saying, I'm gay, but we're going to get married anyway?
I think that I'm trying to think how old Josh is, but I think he's definitely younger than me. And I mean, I'm guessing they're 10 years older than me. Yes. Okay. So they're about 10 years younger.
37. So.
And I think that right about the late 90s, the early 2000s is when the church started changing its tune on some of their policies around LGBT issues. So for example, it's the first time I heard ever from, you know, on the LDS gays site that they had at the time, it was fairly kind of progressive that they came out and said this is probably due to biology.
Wow.
So that was a huge shift in the church in the late, I think it's the late 90s, early 2000s. And I think at that point, so how old would Josh have been in the early 2000s? I mean, that's again like 10 years. So my generation was still being told, don't tell your prospective spouse. So if you're in your 40s, mid 40s on, you were probably told as a gay person, don't tell your spouse.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in your 30s or lower, you were probably told something differently. And, you know, and I say probably because there's always bishop's roulette and myths and folklores, you know, die later in some areas geographically than others, but especially because they don't really come out and say any of this stuff over the pulpit. But
I know, and if it's biology, then how are you going to change it?
Well, exactly. So I think that they started
saying that. I'm like, well, duh.
Right. So they started telling people, well, yeah, you just kind of have to accept that this is part of your lot in life. You know, we all have struggles. And so this is just your struggle.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are going to get married heterosexually in a heterosexual marriage, go ahead and tell that partner. And, you know, so I think there's a generational gap, I guess is what I'm trying to say, between those in their 40s on and in their 30s below, where they were given different advice, with exceptions, of course.
Right, because it seems like the couples I'm seeing, they know, and they knew going into it. But I think Josh touches on this so well in the letter, is if you're suppressing all of what we just talked about, right, and earlier, you're suppressing all of those urges, and you're suppressing everything, and you haven't done a lot of dating, and you get married really young, and you don't know really what it's like to have a romantic connection with somebody. So,
or a sexual connection.
Exactly, because you're not doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't even know what it is you're actually sort of committing to.
Yeah. Well, because I had seen quite a bit of mixed orientation marriages prior to even the internet. I guess I'm older.
You have more
I've
experience
been
that way than I
practicing for
do.
25 years, right? And so I feel like there's definitely, depending on the age of the people who are coming out, this is definitely my experience, right? Whether they told their spouse or not. And so if they didn't tell their spouse, it's a huge shock and betrayal, because not only are you now coming out, obviously, as a gay person, which is already usually pretty shocking in our community, but your spouse didn't know this going into the marriage. So they often feel like they were completely betrayed and choices were taken from them. They didn't even have a choice in the matter, whether or not they were willing to sign up for something like this. Whereas the newer generation, like what Lolly expressed in that first letter with Josh, was more of this, well, we can be anything together. We're going to have a celestial marriage, and we're, and I think a lot of those caretaking roles that Mormon women have, especially when the man is the gay person. I've seen quite a few of the other as well, where the woman is the lesbian member of the marriage. But in particular, when the wife is heterosexual, she's coming into the marriage with already a lot of messages and a lot of her identity being a caretaker, a comforter, a helpmeet.
Right.
And so she really loves this person. And well, we can, we're on God's side, so we can fix this. Even if it doesn't mean that we're going to fix the orientation, we can fix the marriage. We can make this work somehow because God's on our side, So I see that more in the younger generation of mixed orientation marriages. And so what's hard to do here is, like, on the one hand, I want to honor mixed orientation marriages. I love working with them. I've had many couples where they, try to make it work, and they're in work with me where that's the goal, and they're trying to stay together, and I completely honor that. And then I have a lot of also mixed orientation marriages where they're deciding whether or not to open their marriage or to separate somehow. And so I totally honor that. But I think what's interesting about this public dialogue with Josh and Lolly is that you see their progression and how they think about it, and how now, well, back then, I think the dialogue was a lot of Mormons, a lot of active believing Mormons would say, well, see, why can't you do what Josh and Lolly are doing? Even though Josh and Lolly themselves said, please don't do that.
Right.
Please don't use us to compare other people. Everybody's got to do their own journey. But you can't not help but see them as the poster children.
Working. They're doing
right.
Exactly.
Like, why can't my son or my daughter do what Josh and Lolly are doing?
Yep.
Look at the lovely family they have. They're married in the temple. They're active. They have all the blessings. They are an eternal family. How could people not look to that and then project that onto their own LGBT family members?
And I didn't even think of it that way as a parent. Like, of course you would want that as a LDS parent. Of course you'd want that for your child, right?
Right.
A lot of people, anyway, I shouldn't say of course, but a lot of people would be wanting their children to be kind of doing exactly what Josh and Lolly were doing.
Right. So I think that was the main critique of their, which, and so I felt like both of those things. I was the yes and. It's like, yes, I totally support your story as two individuals. And I see how this can also be really problematic for other, especially LGBT members in the Mormon community who are trying to navigate these really difficult conversations and relationships within their own lives and their Mormon family constructs, right? So it's interesting that this new post starts off with, they say, which we sincerely apologize to every member of the LGBTQI community. So they just start off right away by saying we hurt people without even realizing we were hurting people.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about that? Like, what do they start talking about? What do they see that they didn't see 5 years ago? What do they see now?
Yeah, sure. So what's sticking in my head is towards the end, what he said and what she said. So I think it really goes back to him feeling like, and her too, I think, but him feeling like he didn't realize there was like a part of himself that he was continually shutting down.
Right. Like he
And she
calls
was
it
doing the
out.
same thing, but he definitely wasn't. And he's like, I thought it was happy. I thought I was doing well. I thought it was fine, but I didn't realize I was continually shutting this part of who I was down.
Yeah, it's this whole concept that I don't know that a lot of people fully understand. It's called internalized homophobia. And most people who are oppressed in some way deal with internalized something or other. So those of us who are women, for example, we might have internalized bigotry or misogyny idea, kind of ways that we don't even realize that we are part of a system that oppresses us because we have to survive within that system. Like, it's just been interesting to see myself just through my own feminist journey, things that I can remember adamantly super feisty defending, back when I was more of a traditional member when it came to the priesthood.
I was probably on the opposite side of you.
Right, ordination, right.
Battling back.
We don't need the priesthood, right? We are super powerful as is. Only men who are lame need the priesthood. I said things like that, that I really wholeheartedly disagree with now.
Yeah.
But that was a journey, and I need to honor every part of myself throughout that journey. And so this is why it's so hard to talk about these topics, because there will probably be people listening to us who are in a mixed orientation marriage who maybe feel like that is their most authentic, wonderful choice. And they would see maybe this discussion is very disrespectful of that choice of theirs.
We try to be really careful.
Yeah. And then there's this idea of internalized homophobia, which I don't know how you don't have that growing up in our culture.
Exactly. And I think that's kind of what he's saying here. He's recognizing, and I think the apology is coming from is that they understand how many lives they actually touched, how many people they actually had an impact on. So I think that's a huge part of it. And that I don't think they realized, because they didn't realize themselves what was happening.
Right.
It took them years to kind of understand how unhappy in a way they both were, right? That they weren't willing to recognize. Or he says that he didn't even see it. He was just in denial.
Right. Right. And this is where I think I want to say, not everybody will necessarily go down that same path. I think that there are mixed orientation marriages that last and that they stay together for a variety of reasons. And I'm not going to say they're not happy or they're not fulfilled. I think that's every person has a right to say what they are or are not in their relationships. But a pattern, I guess I will say, that I've noticed is that when the person who is homosexual in a heterosexual marriage starts giving that orientation space, mental space, like just being able to come out or being able to think about themselves from that perspective, it becomes harder and harder for them to keep everything in the organized box, right? That they needed to kind of have in order to be able to go through with these ways of managing their life. And so I guess I would see Josh maybe falling into that same that I've seen.
And he even said it here, and I'm trying to think. So this is under his second point. Love of self as a gay person is the title of the second point that he talks about her. And his friend says, Josh, you realize your sexual orientation is beautiful, right? Not just tolerable, it's beautiful. And then he says, I could hardly even register what he was trying to say. So they had a huge dialogue around this.
And I love that he really includes Lolly in this conversation, because her perspective, because again, I don't think that we are taught to be sexual beings. or like we talk a lot about sexuality, but we're not really, I think, grasping the actual Mormon doctrine that is we are sexual beings. So when she goes into this marriage, from this kind of caretaker position, and she's going to be the good friend, who can do this with her friend and this man that she loves. I don't know that she was really taught, like most of us, how to tap into her own sexuality and her own chemistry, like that chemistry when a man looks at you in a way and you look at that man in a way, I'm talking about heterosexually here, but
Right.
you look at each other in a way that something just happened between you, that is something pretty powerful. And
the connection, the intimacy, the passion, that you don't have with a friend, right? This is what I tell couples.
Right.
And granted, it's not to the T, but the sex piece is the one thing that separates your relationship from all the other relationships in your life.
Right. Like you should have a lot of friends, but you shouldn't necessarily be having sex with them. Well, I guess you can. I'm not trying to be judgy.
Right? That's our sex positive therapist coming up.
But at least with this one person in your life, that should be like a difference between other special people in your life.
Yeah. And I think that she didn't realize like that, but she says, it was missing. I was missing for years. Right.
And she even talks about how it affected her body image. Like she talks about how she's gained some weight. She's just not really in touch with that sensual part of herself because I think, even though I think Josh absolutely loves her and is very dedicated to her, there's just something he can't offer as a gay man to her.
Yeah. He didn't
that
desire
wanting
her in
and
a
that
way
desire that moves you in those particular situations.
And if you haven't, not that I'm advocating to do this, but if you haven't had those early sexual experiences, right? Even passionate kissing, you're not going to know because you had, like I said before, you're not going to know what you're missing. Right. Until you've already taken that step and you're married. And now all of a sudden we understand, maybe it's not there like it is for other people.
Yeah, and I don't want to be misunderstood because I'm not a believer that you have to have sex before you're married, to know if you're sexually compatible. I mean, I always tell people, there's plenty of people who have sex before they're married, have really hot sex, and then still end up on my couch 20 years later,
right?
And are having sexual issues.
Yeah,
and there's people, many. There's people who've never had sex before they're married and really hit it off really well in that department. So I'm not trying to be correlational here, but I do think that sometimes, going back to the adolescent studies that we talked about earlier, when we make it so rigid, you don't have to have sex with somebody to have, like you're saying, a passionate kiss, to give into that sexual kind of chemistry and try some of that out with certain people as you're dating. I think that's an actually healthy thing to do. It doesn't have to include vaginal, penile sex, again, from a heterosexual perspective. Right. But I think that what the messages I often hear at church are any two people can make it as long as they have God on their side, as long as they're both focused on God. And that's not a true statement. No. And also I hear.
And that's a devastating statement for some people because they end up in our office and they're trying to unpack. But I prayed about this person and I got an answer that I was supposed to marry this person. How can he be abusing me? Right? Or something along those lines. It comes up often. Yeah. And I'm sure you hear the same thing.
Yeah. And I think I see a lot of the friendship marriages, even in heterosexual marriages, where they both are heterosexual. And again, we teach them what to look for in a relationship. And it's all about this responsibility stuff. Did they go on a mission?
They're a good dad. They're going to be a good provider.
Going to be a good provider. Is she going to be a good mom?
Yeah.
Are they loving? And, and so a lot of people, you think, well,
service,
like there's a lot of people with wonderful traits.
which
And
are
so,
all really wonderful things, right?
yeah,
Or
right.
positives. But when you're not in touch with your own sexual self or sexuality, then how can you be, if you're not in tune with that, how can you be finding a partner that you're going to be in tune with that way?
Right. Right.
Just even from more of a biological standpoint.
Right.
Right? They say, I've heard before, that you're sizing somebody up subconsciously when you meet them, a partner, to see if your bodies are going to fit well together sexually.
Yeah, we're
But
almost taught like that's a bad thing, like you're objectifying or you're lusting after somebody if you're focused on those kinds of things. And I've even had people in my office that have said things like, well, I was actually really, I thought it was a good thing that we weren't really that tempted to make out and, do those kinds of things because we could more easily get to the temple. And I'm like, oh, yikes. It's actually the couples that can barely get to the temple that I'm thinking have a better chance of sexual compatibility. Right? And I've definitely heard that a lot in my mixed orientation marriages, that especially, again, the heterosexual woman will say, well, he was the only one who didn't grope me or try to touch me, and I felt very respected by him in that regard, and safe.
Right?
Yeah. Which I'm not saying you should be groping your girlfriends.
No.
But I'm just saying that
Consent.
there wasn't that same chemistry and that same intensity that maybe other men were sharing with her, as a woman.
Yeah.
So
that was hard for her, really hard, I'm sure. And to realize, like, wow, I've been, how many years, I think, were they married? Almost 16, without having a man look at her that way, desire her that way. And I thought one thing she touched on was very, very profound. And I think we've all, at least heterosexual people, have probably been guilty of something like this before. But everyone said when they found out she was getting divorced that she deserved to have a man look at her that way. That she deserved to have that kind of relationship she's looking for in that, marriage later on. That nobody ever says that to the gay person.
To Josh, right.
Yeah.
In fact, he can be equally villainized. Yeah. Like you're the one that kind of ruined her life.
That kind of love, that kind of crush, that kind of romance.
Right. Yeah, we really do not do that. We really otherize the LGBT community in that way, where we don't see that as important. I mean, I've just heard horrific metaphors in Mormonism where, well, people in wheelchairs can't have sex. Actually, they can. There's a lot of great ways that people have sex, even though they're dealing with disabilities of some sort or another. But really, it's seen as this, it should be no big deal that you're asked to have this celibate position for your entire life, given what we are telling you the afterlife is about. Boy, that is really a huge struggle, and of course goes into a lot of deeper topics that we've also brushed on before, as far as levels of suicidality and mental health issues and substance abuse dependence in LGBTQIA communities, because there's so much community rejection.
Yeah, and Josh was talking about it. And he didn't even, really stop to think. He'd had a ton of suicidal thoughts.
Right.
And that the thought of going another 4 decades in this relationship was really kind of devastating for him. Probably not kind of, was devastating.
Yeah.
And it seemed unbearable. And I think you said it perfectly. It was just finally some of the stuff I think was spilling out of that little tiny box. And I think it's really, you and I say this all the time, we're born sexual beings and we die sexual beings. I mean, this is a huge part of who we are as human beings. It's the core of who we are. And you're asking somebody to repress the core of who they are and not act on that. And I think that's where a big part of that suicidality comes from. And Josh talks about it as attachment, right? We all sort of yearn, most of us, to be connected in this way to another person and attached to another person.
In this romantic, sexual way, not just a friendship. And people who are gay and lesbian deserve that just as much as we do. So I think, to be clear about my position, I mean, if you're in a mixed orientation marriage and choose to see me professionally or, Shannon professionally, we will support that marriage.
Definitely.
If you want us to. Absolutely. We understand the construct of why you're in that situation. At the same time, you are in that situation because of the construct. So we can't ignore, that part of those decisions were made within the Mormon construct, which is fine. Those are your values. Those are your decisions. We honor that. And at the same time, I do hold the position that this is an untenable position for us to continue to keep LGBTQIA plus members of our church in these horrific catch-22s where really the decisions are impossible and are not required on any same level from heterosexual cisgender folks. And we really, really need to address this if we're going to be able to, have healthy members in our church who are born and are formed in this way, just like all of us who are heterosexual and all the biases that we have and we don't understand and cannot project your own experience onto people who are living these kinds of experiences and decisions that are really impossible.
Yeah, it's a really hard decision. I'm going to choose to either get married so I can at least grow old with somebody and love somebody, even if I'm not sexually attracted to them, or I just have to kind of be alone and choose not to act, choose to shut down this part of myself. And there's probably people that are, able to do it and are happy. But I think that our rates of suicide and problems show that a lot of people aren't able to do it.
Yeah, and John Dehlin and Bill Bradshaw and several people have done some actually really good research on mixed orientation marriages. I don't think there's a lot of research out there on it. The statistics are not great. I mean, of course, nobody
is a statistic.
So that's why, there's always exceptions. And there are people, I think, who make this work in ways that really feel authentic to them. And I will always honor that. And yet the statistics are not good, both from a mental health perspective and also from a divorce perspective. So, and usually not because people aren't, I think a lot of people are in a similar situation like Josh and Lolly, where they are actually good friends. That's been my experience anyway. That these people are very connected, usually parent well together, usually
get along well.
Sometimes I'm like, wow, you guys really communicate so well. I guess you'd almost have to, right? To be able to address some of these issues that they're dealing with. So that's out there. The research is not necessarily positive about this. And I think I want to finish with just some words from Josh himself, where they say, we're sorry to any gay Mormon who even had a moment's pause as they tried to make the breathtakingly difficult decision that I am now making, to love myself fully for exactly what God made me because of our post. We're sorry for any degree that our existence and the publicity of our supposedly successful marriage made you feel less than, as you made your own terribly difficult choices. And we're sorry if our story made it easier for people in your life to reject you and your difficult path as being wrong. If this is you, we want you to know you were right. You did the correct, brave thing. You are ahead of me in the sense that you've progressed through things I have yet to progress through. I've got to give Josh props. That's a lot to say.
I agree. I was thinking the same thing as you were reading that.
That's a lot. And then he continues, we're sorry to any gay Mormon who received criticism, backlash, or hatred as a result of our story. It wasn't long after our post that we began to get messages from the LGBTQIA community letting us know that their loved ones were using our blog post to pressure them to get married to a person of the opposite gender. Sometimes even disowning them, saying things like, if these two can do it, so can you. Our hearts broke as we learned of the ways our story was used as a battering ram by fearful, uninformed parents and loved ones desperate to get their children to act in the ways they thought they were best. And this is where I also want to just place, responsibility where it should be. I think parents do bear some responsibility, but parents are part of a construct and system that the church has created with very strong messages against homosexuality for decades. And until our church leaders address that directly, I can't hold parents and family members wholly responsible for that. So, yeah.
It's heavy. It's heartbreaking and heavy. And I think this is going to be really powerful, and probably already has. And I know, I don't remember the date this came out, but
it was January.
So it's been about 5-6 months. So
right.
Probably has resonated with a lot of people.
Again, I feel like there's always people who are going to feel betrayed by things like this, right? So when they first came out with their original post, I think, members of the LGBTQI community who were trying to live authentic lives within their own lifestyles probably felt very betrayed by this. And now I'm guessing people in mixed orientation marriages are feeling very betrayed by this new post, right? So I think it's a hard balance.
And worried, right? Both of them, it's anxiety, worry.
Right. We thought we could have hope. Does this mean we don't have hope?
Yeah.
Are people looking at our marriages like it's ridiculous and stupid that we're still together? Yeah, it's really hard all the way around.
It is. It really is. And there's no easy, I don't think, solution to it all.
Well, I've kept you for the hour I promised you.
Yeah, you're great. Thank you.
I know.
I'm sure you go on.
Baby brain to bed. But I really appreciate this deeper dive because I had kind of just glazed over it because I knew it was so heavy that I knew I wanted to revisit it at some point. So I appreciate you sitting down with me and kind of looking this over and willing to do that. So
yeah.
Definitely.
No, it was awesome. Thanks for having me. I always love it when you have me here.
All right. Well, we will see you. For those of you who are donors or subscribers, please continue to help me out in that regard. I need donations for Mormon Mental Health Podcast if that's going to continue past 2018. And Mormon Sex Info depends on subscribers. So I really want to help just offer comprehensive sexual education any way I can. And I'm thinking about making certain archived parts of Mormon Sex Info free so that anybody can access things. I don't want price to be a reason why people don't access information. At the same time, I need support in this work. So if you value what I'm trying to do, please consider either a donation to the Mormon Sex Info podcast, which will get you, I try to release weekly. I promise at least 40 episodes per year. So it's not necessarily weekly, but I usually do a little bit more than 40. You get those on a regular basis. You get first access to those. And that helps me continue with that work. And if you're a listener of the Mormon Mental Health Podcast, well then, I can't continue that without support as well. So it all takes money at the end of the day. Isn't that sad? But it's true. And I'm part of that equation. So I really appreciate any of you who are willing to help me in that regard or spread the word or share some of these resources with your family and friends. And Shannon, as usual, thank you so much for joining me tonight and sharing of your valuable time and insights. And we'll see everybody on the next round. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stop beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.